Client didn't pay, so I made his life hell. 8 years ago, I was barely getting my business off the ground. I'd opened a small bed and breakfast. Nothing fancy, just a modest place with a few comfortable rooms. About 3 months prior, I'd sunk every penny I had into renovating, painting walls, buying decent mattresses, adding homey decor, and making sure the dining area looked cozy enough to attract traveling business people or tourists passing through. It was a slow start, like most small businesses, but I remained optimistic. I figured that as long as I stayed afloat the first year, word of mouth would spread, and eventually I'd find my niche. Money was tight, though. I was scraping by, covering rent on the property, making sure utility bills were paid so that my guests had hot showers and working lights, and restocking the kitchen for breakfast supplies. Every small expense felt like a mountain. I can still recall nights lying awake, tallying the next day's groceries against the meager intake from the last few guests. Stress weighed heavy on my chest, but I kept telling myself that if I stuck with it, things would get easier. During that precarious period, I suffered a deeply personal loss. My father passed away. He'd been a rock in my life, always encouraging me to pursue my dreams. Even though he wasn't able to invest financially, he offered guidance and emotional support. When he was gone, I felt unmoored, responsible not just for my business, but also for my mother, who'd been dependent on him for a lot of things, both financial and emotional. She was devastated, and I was by her side almost every day, trying to help her navigate life without him. My own grief felt overwhelming, but I didn't have the luxury to break down. Between my mother needing my help and my small B&B needing constant attention, I was juggling more than I ever thought I could handle. Around that same time, I was engaged, with a wedding date set just a couple of months away. Normally, that would have been a cause for celebration, but now it was just one more financial stressor on a towering pile of worries. Wedding deposits, dress alterations, the costs of feeding guests, plus the ongoing bills. My fiancé tried to help as much as possible, but the reality was that we didn't have a lot to spare. We both worked day and night, sometimes skipping date nights to save money for the future. We tried to keep our spirits high, reminding ourselves that once married, we'd share all burdens equally and navigate life together. Then one day, a new opportunity appeared like a small beacon of hope. A man, I'll call him Mr. X, contacted me about a contract in the area. He said he needed several rooms for his crew to stay in for 6 days. It was dinner, bed, and breakfast for a bunch of people. More business than I'd ever had at once. I remember the excitement surging through me. This could be the break I'd been waiting for. The lump sum from a 6-day group stay could help me clear some bills, set a little money aside for my mother's care, and reduce the stress surrounding wedding expenses. So, without hesitation, I told him I could accommodate them. I'd do everything to ensure they had a pleasant stay. Because my place was so small, I moved heaven and earth to prepare for them. I stocked up on extra groceries to serve decent dinners. I made sure each room was spotless, put fresh linen on every bed, and even provided complimentary snacks, something I typically reserve for special occasions, because I wanted to impress. Mr. X told me he couldn't pay up front, but that he'd add me into their system so that payment could arrive by the following Friday. That was a red flag in hindsight, but back then I was so desperate for the income, I barely thought twice. I took a leap of faith. His team arrived, and for the most part, they seemed fine. I'd chat with them in the dining area, ask about their work, try to gauge if they were satisfied with the meals. Everyone seemed polite enough, though Mr. X was somewhat aloof. He mostly breezed in and out, rarely giving me more than a nod or a quick greeting. Still, I chalked that up to him being busy or stressed with his own responsibilities. In the pit of my stomach, there was a niggling worry about the payment, but I silenced it. I'd had a few late payments before that eventually came through, so I remained cautiously optimistic. Then, on the 6th night, before dawn, really, I woke up to a strange silence. I had grown used to hearing footsteps or chatter at odd hours, since they were on varying schedules, but that night felt especially quiet. I did a quick round to check if everything was okay, only to find all their rooms empty. Beds untouched from the previous day, personal items gone, front door wide open. My heart sank. They'd left in the middle of the night without so much as a goodbye or a note. I rushed to my computer to check if any partial payment had arrived. Nothing. I tried calling Mr. X, but he didn't pick up. I left messages. I emailed. I texted. No response. Panic gripped me. I'd used almost all my liquid funds to feed and accommodate his crew for 6 days. It was a significant chunk of money. Money that I desperately needed to keep my business afloat. Over the next few months, I attempted every possible method to get in touch. I rang him day after day, letting my phone ring until it went to voicemail. I fired off countless emails, each one more urgent than the last. All I got was silence or sometimes vague promises. Yes, we'll look into it. But the payment never arrived. 6 months passed. My father's absence weighed on me daily, and I struggled to help my mother cope with the loss of her spouse. I was also knee-deep in wedding preparations, though my joy was overshadowed by mounting debt. Because Mr. X never paid, I was forced to take out a loan to cover the costs of his stay. It wasn't a small loan either. I had to use part of it for my personal bills, because the chunk of money I'd expected from his contract job simply never arrived. The interest rates weren't kind. I can't count the number of tears I shed, thinking how unfair it was that someone could casually destroy my small livelihood without repercussions. Yet, the world kept spinning. Eventually, I got married, though it was a smaller, more modest ceremony than we'd initially planned. We had to cut corners in every possible way. Fewer guests, a simpler venue, minimal decorations. Thankfully, my family and close friends were supportive. They understood I was struggling. Still, in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but feel robbed of what should have been a joyous, carefree day. And all because of one man who decided he could just skip out on the bill. The memory of his betrayal festered. I'd been raised to believe in fairness. If you agreed on a service, you paid for it. If you made a promise, you kept it. I tried to rationalize his behavior. Maybe he'd run out of funds, or maybe some complicated bureaucratic mistake happened. But none of that excused him for ghosting me like that, never even trying to pay me back over time. The phone calls, the emails, I had proof he was ignoring me. As the months turned into a year, my patience dried up. I realized I was never going to see that money, nor would I receive an apology. That's when bitterness hardened into resolve. I won't lie. I wanted revenge. I wanted him to feel even a fraction of the stress, misery, and hopelessness he'd caused me. A moral voice in the back of my head argued that stooping to his level wasn't right. But then I'd recall the countless nights I couldn't sleep. The nights I worried whether I'd have to close my B&B, the heartbreaking decisions to cut wedding expenses, the humiliating phone calls I had to make to lenders, begging them to give me more time. The anger drowned out any moral hesitation. I decided to give him a taste of his own medicine. Initially, it started small. I'd call him from a private number. My reasoning was that if I used my normal number, he'd just ignore it. So I blocked my ID and dialed, typically late at night. The first few times I'd try to speak with him or leave a message about the money he owed me, he'd hang up or not answer. Frustration ate at me, so I escalated. I'd set alarms on my phone for random times. 1:0 a.m., 3:0 a.m., 5:0 a.m., and I'd call him repeatedly. Sometimes I'd say nothing and hang up. Other times I'd just mention his debt in a single phrase. When are you paying me what you owe? And then disconnect. It gave me a sense of grim satisfaction, imagining him waking up groggy or irritated, cursing the unknown caller. This continued off and on for months. Any time I was up late or had to wake in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, I'd make sure to give him a ring. Eventually, he disconnected that number. That was my first mini-victory. He'd been forced to lose contact with whoever else had that number, presumably to escape me. In the process, I hoped it caused him hassles with clients, friends, or whoever needed to reach him. 1 point for me, but that was just the beginning. Once I had a new number for him, which I discovered through a bit of internet snooping, I pulled the same routine. Private calls, random hours. Then, to up the ante, I started scouring the web for ways to sign him up for spam. I registered his email on countless mailing lists, newsletter subscriptions, winner free phone pages. You name it. I also found porn sites that allowed you to create a free account if you provided an email, so I'd sign him up there too. I was relentless, filling every possible form I could with his details. If he had any sense, his inbox would be flooded with junk 24/7. Maybe that would give him a fraction of the headache he gave me. I also posted reviews wherever I could, naming him and his so-called business as thieves and scammers. Travel forums, local business directories, social media pages. I left scathing remarks about how he'd taken advantage of a small B&B owner, Aintree. I spelled out his full name, the name of his contract company. Over time, I noticed his business changed names or rebranded. which only fueled my belief that my bad reviews might be making it hard for him to operate under the same brand. Good. Let him struggle. Occasionally I'd see him post photos on Facebook. It was always something smug. Fancy dinners, new car pictures, or him boasting about some accomplishment. Without fail, I'd comment, "Remember when you stole from me?" Or, "How can you afford that car when you owe me money?" And sometimes I'd call him a con artist in front of his friends. He'd delete or block me, so I started messaging his friends directly, explaining how he had scammed me. Some believed me, some blocked me. Either way, it must have been embarrassing or at least inconvenient for him. Eventually, he made his profile completely private, probably to keep me out. Another small victory for me. On days I felt particularly spiteful, I'd pick up the phone, Google the businesses near his location, and make calls. I'd claim he was selling drugs out of his shop or was involved in shady dealings. I have no clue if any of those calls led to investigations, or if people just shrugged me off, but it felt good to plant seeds of suspicion. If I couldn't get my money back, I wanted to give him a taste of paranoia, the sense that at any moment someone might scrutinize him. I know how all of this must sound: petty, vindictive, borderline obsessive, and I won't argue with that assessment. But at the time, all I could see was the memory of how desperate I'd been when he cheated me out of my livelihood, how humiliating it was to beg for an extension on my bills, how I had to explain to my mother that I couldn't help her with certain expenses because I was in over my head. I felt like I had no recourse. Small claims court was an option, sure, but he was slippery, operating in a different city. Lawyers cost money I didn't have. The justice system can be agonizingly slow, especially for cross-regional disputes where the sum might be too small for a bigger case. But it was huge money for me. So, I relied on the only avenue I had: consistent harassment. And you know what? Over the years, my B&B actually managed to survive. Word spread that my place was cozy, that I went above and beyond for guests. And eventually I attracted a loyal clientele of travelers. I expanded, adding a couple more rooms. My financial situation stabilized. I was able to refinance my debt, and I finally got out from under those crippling loan payments. My mother's situation improved a bit too. She found emotional support in local groups, and from me, and we made do with what we had. By the time I approached the 8-year mark of owning the B&B, I was financially secure, had paid off the loans, and was no longer haunted by the specter of immediate bankruptcy. But I never stopped despising him. I never forgot how his actions nearly ruined me at the worst possible time. So, even though my fortunes improved, my vendetta continued in smaller ways. An anonymous tip here, a private phone call there, the occasional smear campaign post online. He switched to new businesses, or so I heard, but none seemed to last very long. Maybe it was the market, or maybe it was the accumulation of negative reviews I'd plastered all over the internet. Either way, his ventures kept closing down, and each time I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. By the time I finally got over the raw anger, years later, I suspect I'd done plenty of damage to his personal and professional reputation. Maybe more than the initial debt. To be clear, I'm not proud in the moral sense, but I also don't regret it. Some might say I should have let karma handle it, or that I should have been the bigger person and moved on. But for me, those phone calls, sign-ups, and negative reviews were a catharsis. Every time I inflicted a little chaos on his life, I reminded him that I existed, that I wasn't just some faceless individual he could scam and forget it. I was real, and I was determined to make him remember that he'd hurt me. Over time, I gleaned that he'd changed his phone number multiple times. On social media, he was basically a ghost. No public posts, no photos, no way to leave a comment. Perhaps he had a small circle of close friends who believed his side of the story, but the important thing is that he couldn't flaunt himself publicly without me swooping in top. That was a small measure of justice in my eyes. On the surface, life went on. My B&B grew. I found myself hiring staff as business picked up, and I was able to step back from working 16-hour days to something more manageable. My mother's mental health improved, and she learned to live her life independently. She'd sometimes tease me about how I'd lost my mind with revenge, but I think a part of her understood. She knew how close I was to disaster and how alone I felt after my father's passing. My husband, too, was a pillar of support. While he found my methods questionable, he respected my anger and never told me to stop. He probably knew better than to get in the way of that fury. At some point, I heard through the grapevine that Mr. Emily's so-called contract business had dissolved completely. They had lost clients left and right, battered by poor customer feedback and trust issues. Did my reviews alone cause that collapse? Probably not, but maybe they contributed. Maybe enough people read my warnings online, or maybe enough small businesses realized he was a risk not worth taking. A year or two later, I heard he'd moved to another city to start fresh. I didn't bother to investigate. By then, I was too busy enjoying my success to give him more than a passing thought. Still, if he posted anything under his name or tried to set up a new venture using the same email or phone number, I'd see it eventually. My vigilance was borderline obsessive, yes, but it made me feel secure. And if I found him, I'd drop a new round of negative commentary, a few scathing reviews, or sign him up for more spam. I have no doubt it wore him down. Possibly more than once he woke up to a barrage of intrusive calls, or found his inbox stuffed with adult site confirmations. Maybe he'd turn white with rage, cursing the day he decided to skip out on my bill. I know that vengeance stories rarely paint the narrator in a flattering light. I'm okay with that. I won't pretend it was noble, or that I was crusading for all small business owners who got cheated. I did it for myself, because to me, that man symbolized the worst kind of opportunist. Someone who feeds on the vulnerability of small-time entrepreneurs who can't afford a drawn-out legal battle. He represented every unscrupulous person who thinks they can walk away from their obligations, and I wanted him to learn, even if just in a petty, punishing way, that there can be consequences for such behavior. Sometimes, during quieter moments, I'd reflect on the years I spent hounding him. Part of me wondered if I'd let him live rent-free in my mind for too long. Maybe I had. After all, if I'm devoting mental energy to sabotage, wasn't I just prolonging my own suffering? But on the flip side, each act of petty revenge also reminded me how far I'd come. I'd taken his blow, stumbled, but ultimately rose stronger. My B&B stood, flourished even. He couldn't take that away from me. Eventually, my life got so busy that my calls and sign-ups tapered off naturally. I had employees to manage, expansions to plan, and personal milestones to celebrate. My husband and I had an anniversary getaway, traveling for the first time in ages, enjoying luxuries I once thought were forever out of reach. My mother became more social, taking up community classes, and it warmed my heart to see her smile genuinely again after so much sadness. But if anyone were to ask, would you do it all over again? The truth is, I would. I don't believe in turning the other cheek anymore, not in extreme cases where someone tries to crush your livelihood. Maybe some people would handle it differently, with more grace or acceptance. But for me, it was a matter of principle and survival. He was the one who kicked me when I was at my lowest point, just after losing my dad, juggling wedding plans and fighting to keep my new B&B afloat. That cruelty, that cowardice of sneaking away in the night, cemented my resolve. Even today, whenever I remember that period, I feel a twinge of anger, but it's mixed with pride now. Pride in having survived, thrived, and taught him a lesson, however small. If he'd simply apologized at some point, offered a payment plan, or showed even a shred of remorse, maybe my rage would have subsided. But he didn't. So I used every tool at my disposal to make sure his life was as inconvenient as possible. I'd like to think that in the years since, he's learned not to mess with small businesses. Perhaps he's realized that not everyone is a doormat. Or maybe he's still out there, scamming others. If he is, I hope someone else picks up the torch of retribution. I'm done carrying that burden, content with what I accomplished. My B&B stands as a testament to my resilience, crowded with guests who appreciate what I offer, staff that I pay fairly and on time, and reviews that glow with genuine praise. When I flip the sign to open each morning, I feel a wave of satisfaction knowing that I persevered, that I refused to be a victim. People sometimes talk about letting go to achieve inner peace. In my case, the act of not letting go, at least until I'd inflicted some measure of retaliation, gave me the closure I needed. Over time, yes, I eased up. I found ways to channel my energy into growth and positivity. But I can't deny that my long stretch of midnight calls and vengeful internet antics played a role in my healing. Odd as that sounds, that's my story, raw and unfiltered. The moral is messy, but it's mine. And if you ask me, I'm pretty sure I caused him far more grief than the money he originally owed. Enough that he might think twice before pulling that stunt again on anyone else. I still haven't forgotten his name, though, or the look on his face the day he waltzed into my B&B. It's etched into my memory, a permanent reminder of the time I was at my lowest, and how I clawed my way back, one vindictive phone call at a time. If he's still out there living under a new business name or a new phone number, that's fine. I've moved on to better things, but I hope he remembers me, the small B&B owner he tried to cheat, and how badly it backfired on him. If I ever cross paths with him again, I'll smile because I'll know exactly who I am. The one he couldn't break, the one who turned the tables, and the one who made his life hell for 8 long years. And that, in the end, is victory enough for me.